Hey everybody, this is my sort of secondary temporary quarantine tank, and I recently lost a lot of fish in here. Almost all my guppies have died. In fact, I think by now all the guppies are now dead. I've got 3 out of 8 surviving pearl gouramis. There's one guppy sort of swimming around funny, so we definitely have one still in there. And surprisingly, the ember tetras, which I expected to be a much more sensitive fish, they've all done fine. Well, they've all survived, I should say. I don't know if they've done fine, but they've all survived. So I've been thinking more and more about what's going on in this tank and why I had such an unusual ammonia spike, because I've put that number of fish, or at least that amount of bioload, in quarantine tanks before, and I've never had any problem, which is why I was not expecting to have any problems this time. And what it is I began listening to the advice of other people, and I stopped having a lot of stuff in my quarantine tanks. I used to have at least a couple of large rocks and some substrate, and all of that stuff makes up for surface area that gives you biofiltration. And so my tanks were always able to sort of accommodate a slightly larger bioload. But I was always told by everybody that a quarantine tank should be bare bottom, nothing in it, no nothing or whatever. It's just there to absorb the fish. You want it as sterile as possible, etc., etc. And so I gradually started moving that way, and it's just not a way of keeping a quarantine tank that I'm used to. I've got the little faux plants in there, the little plastic plants in there, just to provide the fish with a little bit of cover, a little bit of sense of security. But I checked again this morning. I'm still getting a little bit of ammonia, and I've been doing water changes fairly regularly. I've been keeping on top of it, and I really, with the reduced bioload in the tank, I'm now down lower than I started. I used to have a tank full of guppy fry, and all the guppies are dead now. So I've got less bioload than I had before, yet I'm still seeing ammonia showing up in the tank. So what occurred to me this morning is that rather than have all of the lot of biofiltration like I normally do, all I've got is whatever this little wafer thin sponge is able to hold. So even though that's all grungy and gross, it's maxed out. I can't get any more biofiltration out of that little tiny filter on this tank. So no matter how much I let it sit there, and no matter how much I wait for it to finish cycling in, it's never going to be able to handle any kind of larger capacity as far as me putting a bunch of pearl gouramis back in there, because I do plan on buying more pearl gouramis once I get this sorted out. So what I'm going to do is something that I did a long time ago in an old tank of mine. I never liked it, but it'll come in very handy right here. So let me put you on pause half a second. And we are going to use biosponge. So this is meant to go in the corner of a tank, and then this piece up here allows directional flow. You can change where, which direction you want the bubbles to come out and flow, and then it also telescopes, so you can adjust whether the height of the water and whether you want it to flow above the water or below the water line or whatever. So it's a really neat little sponge filter. But I don't like sponge filters, especially in small tanks. I bought this a long time ago to go in my 20-gallon crab tank. Or originally it might even have been in Butterbean's little 20-gallon brackish tank, and it allowed for a lot of biofiltration and some bubbles across the surface. But I never liked it, and I never used it. So we're going to set this back up in the tank again. And while we're here, I will say, not getting any nitrite showing up in the tank, and this morning we had very, very little ammonia, but there was ammonia. I was getting some ammonia, so we are going to put this in. We'll get it set up, we'll get the bubbles going, and then we'll go have a look at the tank once I get that all set up. All right, makes it look like a stock tank or a quarantine tank, but in this case that's all right, because that's exactly what it is. Now, this is still going to be temporary for me. I am going to be tearing all this down once I'm done messing around with getting the new fish. This is actually just sitting in the corner of my basement in front of my furnace, so it can't stay here anyway. But in the meantime, if I'm going to have it set up, then I need to have it set up properly, and having that additional sponge filter in there is going to go a long way to making this tank safe for all the additional fish I put in. So if you'll notice, the grunge and stuff on the bottom. That is because I pulled the biofilter out of the back of the hang on the back and I swished it around in the tank, and hopefully that will cause some of that to get pulled into that sponge and will sort of seed the sponge and get it started. And you can see I've offset the direction that the bubbles flow just a little bit, so it circulates the water around the tank. And I also want to make it clear that I don't suggest that just because a tank has the capacity to have a lot of biofiltration means you can just drop a whole bunch of fish in the tank. The tank still needs to catch up to the bio load that's in there. Having the capacity to deal with it is necessary, but you also have to give the tank time to get caught up to do that. Now, when a tank is just getting started and the cycle is just beginning, you have very little bacteria in the tank. And under optimal conditions, the best conditions you can get would give you a reproduction rate of about every 36 hours, you're going to double the amount of bacteria you've got. So when you're just starting out, there's not a lot of bacteria. Going from 1 to 2 isn't much of an increase. I know you're doubling it, but you're doubling a very small number. But if you've ever done that little game where you double your penny every day for a month to see how much money you end up with, it's an astonishing amount of money, because once that number starts getting a little bit bigger, it starts growing rapidly. And so that's where we are. We're in a tank that has some biofiltration already, and once this sponge filter gets a good amount of bacteria growing in it and there's room for more, then I can double the amount of bacteria in a day and a half or 2 days. So putting 6 or 8 small gourami in this tank might put a little bit of a strain on the system, but it wouldn't be for very long before the system caught up to it. But you've got to have the biofiltration there in the first place. You got to have the capacity for the biofiltration in order for it to do that. And a bare glass bottom tank with that little tiny biosponge just wasn't enough, apparently. Now, I did wrap a coarse sponge around the intake filter, and I assumed that that would actually act as a sponge filter. I thought that that would give me a considerable amount of biofiltration right there. And I'm sure it does, but it still apparently was not giving me enough because of the obvious, catastrophe I just had, all those fish I just lost. So there you go. We're going to give that several days. We're going to keep an eye on the tank. I'm going to keep checking the ammonia. And when I start adding new fish to the tank, I won't do a dozen at a time or whatever I did last time. I think I did 12 or 15 fish all in one go to a tank that already had a lot of guppy fry and fish swimming around in it. Again, bare glass bottom, small tank, probably already had the bio load maxed out, and then I dumped 12 or 15 more fish in the tank. So not blaming anybody but myself on that one, but live and learn. And now I've got this sponge filter in there, so everything should be fine. All right, everybody, thanks for watching that one. Make sure you subscribe. You don't want to miss anything I got coming up. See you real soon in the next one.